2 minutes past midday. Thanks for your company. 29.1 degrees. A little bit cooler today, which is very pleasant indeed. As we promised you, Trevor Tough, Outback Grave Markers, is in the studio. Good to see you, Trev. I tell you what, we'd see you coming about 10 miles from here with your big hat on today. That's the biggest wide brim hat I've ever seen.
People don't know me if I don't have my hat on.
Is that right? Well, I've not seen you with it before. Well, it's obviously practical when you go back out into the outback. That's what they would have been wearing, the guys up there, I suppose, working on the stations. That's really good. Good for our beaches. Thank you, as always, for coming in. A quick update from yourself.
Okay, we've been pretty busy since we spoke last, and we've been successful in our grant application to Monara Community Foundation, and they've given us a bunch of money which has allowed us to complete the fundraising, and we now have the ability to purchase our new laser engraving machine. And this will make it possible for us to make large signs for the shires and to properly mark their cemeteries and historical sites. It's quite a turning point.
And for these people in these areas, they're going to love the fact you've done this.
Yes.
Good.
And we're currently making 144 plaques for Sandstone Cemetery, and they'll be placed in mid-April. It's been a huge job for our research team. They've been working on this since May last year to get all the stories about the people who died there. And then that's April. In May, we'll be going to Menzies Shire to place 26 plaques at Comet Vale, and then another 32 at Davyhurst. In July, August, we want to go up to the Pilbara, where we have plaques to place at Condon, which is the original port just north of Port Hedland on De Grey Station. And then we've got 4 other stations to do, and if we have time, we'll go on to the Kimberley. And then in September, we're scheduled to go to the shires of Wiluna and Laverton to commence work for both those shires because they've supported us with funding this year. So all up this year, we're planning to place probably 700 or 800 plaques.
That is fantastic.
Enormous.
Are you guys all self-funded?
We've been getting funding from these 5 shires.
That's great. Yeah. So for you to plan this now ahead, have all these shires got in touch with you, or have you been aware of unmarked graves in those areas?
We've been working with them, and we asked them what order they would like us to mark the graves, because there's hundreds and hundreds in each of those shires, probably 2,000 to do up there in that area.
There's a story with every one of them.
Pretty much,
Warrawoona.
We had a phone call from a bloke called Gary, and he was a fellow who had mined around the Warrawoona area for some years, and he was interested in finding a burial site there. And he and his mate had searched for some years without success, so he got on to us and asked if we could help. Well, Warrawoona was originally called Salgash, and it's about 20 kilometres south of Marble Bar on the Corunna Downs Road, and some of your listeners will know that Corunna Downs was the site of a huge World War II bombers airstrip.
Really? Okay.
And Salgash was the site of some wonderfully rich gold finds, one being the Klondike mine in 1898, and that was found by Messrs Pont and Corboy. And one report that we've got says that already some perfectly extraordinary crushings have been recorded. In fact, they're almost fabulous. One lot of 4 tonnes gave 400 ounces of gold. Another of 20 tonnes gave 800 ounces, whilst a further parcel of 60 tonnes returned between 6 and 7 ounces per tonne. This is, in today's values, that's multi-million-dollar
That is
find.
huge. Is it still quite prevalent up there, gold?
Little patches,
okay.
And the Pont family was interesting. They moved to WA from South Australia with their 5 boys and 1 daughter to take up sheep property. And theirs is a long and rambling saga of bankruptcy, fraud, imprisonment, even accusations of murder. All the family returned to South Australia except 2 brothers, William and August, or Gus, who were inseparable. William died of lung disease at the age of only 36 on the 12th of November 1896, and his death seems to have badly affected Gus, who died only about 3 years later on the 2nd of January 1900 from alcoholic poisoning and cirrhosis of the liver. So he was doing some serious mourning for William. And Gus was aged 44, and he's buried at Warrawoona, and he's one of the graves we're going looking for.
You don't know where that is?
We're working on it.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So information from Kevin and Yvonne Coates tells us there are actually 2 burial sites there. One had 3 graves and the other had 5 graves, including Gus, which is one of the ones we're after. And a bit of the trouble for us that neither of these 2 burial sites were registered as cemeteries. Normally we can find them as a reserve on the old maps, but these ones aren't. So this is the sort of mystery that we love. And so a bunch of us are all jazzed up about going up there to find these graves, and we'll try and squeeze that into the Pilbara trip in July.
You're sort of reliving their lives, aren't you, when you research their stories?
You feel like you know them or own them.
You do in a way, really. You're sort of dignifying them, you know. You are, very much so. Okay, what about Rudolph?
Rudolph Berenbeck was known as Robert, and he arrived in Sydney on the 14th of May 1881 from Plymouth into British colonial America. And he was 27 years old, and his occupation was recorded as a labourer. He must have taken up some land, but in September 1886, his lease of 160 acres in Ipswich, Queensland, was forfeited. I would imagine Ipswich was pretty isolated in those days.
Definitely.
Yeah. And in November 1896, he sailed on the Lura from Brisbane to Sydney. And the next time we find him is in 1902, and he's in Perth, where he's fined 40 shillings for being in an illegal gaming house. At the age of 64, he was working as a carpenter at Frederick Lieb's farm up in Woburn. Woburns on the Great Northern Highway, not far out, where he died in June 1917 of a degenerated heart. He was buried in the small cemetery by Lieb and Klein, and his probate to Lorman, a solicitor, to oversee his estate was £994, 5 shillings and sixpence. Nearly £1,000. That's a lot of money back then.
You must have worked hard.
And we're going up marking the graves at Woburn over this next few months.
Are people, if they go touring around, travelling around our state, are they able to find these graves? Are they allowed to go to certain areas?
Oh, yes. They can go into the cemeteries.
In the cemeteries. What about the ones on the stations?
On the stations, they have to get the station owner's permission, or the leaseholder if it's a mining lease.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the Murphy brothers?
Well, this is a story about 3 brothers, Pat, Jim and Dan Murphy, and they established the Red Castle mine about 20 kilometres south of Murrin in the Leonora district. Around 1894, they also discovered a rich mine they called the Christmas Gift Mine. Pat Murphy went down to Coolgardie, about 200 miles away, to take the dollar gold, and he attempted to sell the find. Sadly, whilst he was there, he contracted typhoid fever and died, and was buried in the Coolgardie cemetery. This prompted his brother Jim Murphy to go down to Kalgoorlie to arrange matters in connection with his brother's death, and he also caught the fever. Jim was able to return to Red Castle, but died soon after. The other third brother, Dan, grieved by his 2 brothers' death, also caught the disease. He seemed to brighten up and dealt with all the papers in connection with their claim, and signed a will in favour of their only sister, Bridget. However, he died within 5 days of Jim. He was buried in the bush near his brother, with a rude cross marked the spot where the 2 Irish lads were laid to rest. So we need to go and look for those 2 and find those.
Do you have an idea where they are?
We'll start at the Red Castle mine.
Okay. Yeah. Dan Murphy, he hasn't got the alcohol shops around.
No, he
not a descendant.
He died before. It must have been
I thought there might have been a descendant. What a terrible time.
So he was born in Ireland, Dan, and died in late January 1895, aged only 39. And he died of typhoid just as his 2 brothers had in the previous weeks. And 1895 was a terrible year for typhoid right across the goldfields. It's probably the greatest cause of deaths.
Yeah, every generation seems to have some sort of a plague go through, don't they? Yeah. Don't hear of typhoid anymore.
No, well, antibiotics and that on top of it.
That's right,
and cleanliness.
Good point. Jeremiah
O'Brien was the first application for an old age pension in the Kukaini district, and it was made by Jeremiah and his wife, and it was duly recommended by Warden Gibbons. These 2 were verging on 80 years of age. They had landed in New South Wales in 1860 and had resided in Australia and New Zealand ever since. He was the first to locally apply for the old age pension, but he did not live long enough to enjoy the benefits. A local report tells us that Mr. Jeremiah O'Brien, an old Kukaini resident and colonist, I had trouble saying it. I was going to say
colonialist.
Colonist, that's the one. And he expired after a very short illness on Saturday, the 12th of March 1910, and was interred in the Roman Catholic cemetery on Sunday. The funeral service was conducted by Reverend Father Maloney of Menzies. The deceased, who was in his 79th year, left a widow who was about 80 years of age, 3 sons, 2 of whom are shareholders in the Anglo-Saxon mine Pingen, and 1 daughter, Mrs. Ford, who resides in Kalgoorlie.
What, today? Today?
Back then.
Oh, back then. Oh, okay,
Back
sorry.
then, yeah.
Past.
Or she'd be fairly old, yeah.
I wasn't sure what generation you were talking about.
The Anglo-Saxon gold mine was the most substantial gold mine on the field and was active until about 1915.
Mm-hmm.
So poor old Jeremiah O'Brien, a labourer, died of cystitis at Kukaini on the 12th of March 1910, aged 79.
That's quite a good age for that era.
79's good, yeah.
Yeah, even for today's thing. What about Isaac?
Isaac Thompson was born in Deniliquin, New South Wales, and I think he was a bit of a rough nut, it would seem. And he was the 6th of 11 children born to William Thompson, an Irish merchant, and his wife, Anne Isabella Thompson, who was a Scotswoman. And on the 4th of June 1896, at the age of 27, Isaac Thompson and 11 other men stowed away aboard the steamship Thermopylae, bound for the Cape of Good Hope and London. I don't think they were all that clever. Like, you can't hide 12 blokes, can you?
Good point. Very good point.
Trying to stow away.
What a rough trip it would be as well.
Yeah, anyway, on the 11th of June 1896, the ship arrived at Albany, Western Australia, and the 12 stowaways were brought before the police court.
Good point.
One man, on behalf of the others, said they intended to go to the Cape. All men admitted to the charge and were fined £3 each or 4 weeks' imprisonment. The men, on being researched at the lockup, were found to be totally destitute, not a shilling to be found on the lot. And it seems that young Isaac continued to be somewhat unruly and wild, because on New Year's Eve 1906, Isaac Thompson and his mate Martin Burke, who had both been working at Prendergast mine, had been drinking, and they had a fight, during which Thompson received injuries. He was taken to his camp and tended by Burke. I love that, how they just had a fight and then Burke takes his mate away and looks after him.
Stitches him up.
And the following day, Burke went to the Black Range police station, 11 miles away, to report that he believed his friend was dead. An examination of his remains showed severe bruises on the body and face. Burke also bore the appearance of having been knocked about. So Burke was expected to be charged with murder. Isaac had died on the 1st of January 1907, New Year's Day, near Black Range, now Sandstone. He was aged 37, and it was about 10 years after his failed stowaway attempt. An inquiry was held on the 3rd of January following a post-mortem conducted by Dr. A. Keenan. Dr. Keenan found the lungs healthy, the heart dilated and fatty, the liver was very much enlarged and diseased from alcoholism.
Goodness.
The kidneys were also in a diseased state. The membranes of the brain were thickened and full of serous fluid.
What a mess.
Dr. Keenan came to the conclusion that Thompson had died from serous apoplexy and heart failure due to the diseased state of most of the organs through overindulgence in alcohol. So for a young bloke, it seemed he'd given himself a hard time, didn't he?
Did. He went out every night, that bloke.
He did.
Ballantine.
Right, Ballantine Villiamo is an interesting, a bit different story because it's one of seafaring. And he was working on coastal supply boats, or especially pearling luggers in the early days.
Yeah.
Anyone working on those was not conducive to achieving a happy and healthy old age. Storms and shipwrecks and cyclones claimed the lives of many, but poor working and living conditions, and even worse diet, contributed to the deaths of many seamen, pearl divers and boat crew. Deaths from scurvy and beriberi were common. Many who died were taken ashore and buried in sandhills along the coast from Geraldton to Derby. Most of these graves are unmarked, but occasionally erosion by wind and tide reveals a skeleton or two. Many more were simply buried at sea, which saved some effort. The bodies being wrapped in a sheet, weighted down and tossed overboard. And one such was Ballantyne Filiamo, who died on the 30th of March 1896 at Baldwin Creek, aged just 22. He was buried at sea off Carnet Bay, north of Broome in the Kimberley. He was a seaman who died of supposed beriberi after 7 days of illness. He was born in Manila and had been in Western Australia for only 4 months. You've got to ponder how a young man can be reduced to this in just 4
so
months
extreme,
from malnutrition.
Yeah.
And witnesses present at the burial were James Clark and Thomas Nararo. The informant was Frank Biddles, who was his employer on the schooner the Ivy. And there's a street named Biddles Court in Broome now, but there doesn't seem to be anything named after poor young Ballantyne Filiamo.
Well, you'll do something about that, won't you? You get a plaque.
I don't think we'll find him.
Sorry, who was it?
He was jumped over the side, yeah.
I remember the early movies when we were children, if they showed films with, the big ships that were around at the time, they often threw the bodies overboard wrapped in fabric. It was a horrible thing to see that.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have fridges.
No, that's true. Good point. Very good point. Great story. So when do you take off again, Trev?
We'll be going in mid-April up to Sandstone. Okay. So I'll be here for another month. So
okay, good. We'll see you again then.
Month.
Okay, they can go to your website, can they?
They can, yeah, www.outbackgraves.org.
That's simple as that. And I have requested a podcast to be put up on our website.
Lovely, thank
and hopefully Graham can be doing that pretty soon. Go to the curtinfm.com.au website, go to programs, afternoon show, and you should be able to see that there.
Yep.
Thank you, Trev. As always, great stories. Trevor Tough.
Thanks, Jenny.